In this video, we'll be talking about something called the vertical line test. One thing to note is that not every graph on the xy plane belongs to a function. The vertical line test is a tool that we use to determine when a graph belongs to a function or not. It is important to remember that for functions, each input has only one corresponding output. And if we think about this in terms of graphs of functions, inputs correspond with x values and outputs correspond with y values. So the statement that we have here is equivalent to saying that for the graph of a function, each x value only has one corresponding y value. This leads us to the vertical line test, which says that a graph belongs to a function if and only if each vertical line intersects the graph at most once. Let's take a look at some examples of how we would use this vertical line test. For these examples, we want to determine whether or not each of these following graphs belong to a function. In example A, we have the graph of a circle. So to determine if it belongs to a function, we apply the vertical line test. To do so, we draw a vertical line through our graph. If the vertical line crosses the graph more than once, we know that it is not a function, which is what we see here. At this x value where we drew our vertical line, we see that there are two intersections, which means that for this one particular x value, there are two corresponding y values, and we know that cannot happen for functions. So we have to conclude that the graph in example A does not belong to a function. Now let's look at example B. Again, to determine if this belongs to a function, we apply the vertical line test, so we'll draw vertical lines through our graph. But you'll notice that no matter how I draw my vertical lines, each of these vertical lines that I draw only crosses the graph at one point, which tells me that at each x value, there's just one corresponding y value. So we can conclude that this graph does belong to a function. Let's move on to example C. Again, to determine whether a graph belongs to a function, all we have to do is draw vertical lines through our graph. But no matter how we draw our vertical lines, each of these vertical lines will only cross the graph in one spot, which means that each x value only has one corresponding y value. So we can conclude that this graph does belong to a function. Let's now look at example D. Again, we can apply the vertical line test. For example, I can draw a vertical line here. This first vertical line crosses the graph at just one spot, so things are okay so far. However, if I draw a vertical line here, we see that there are three crossings, which means that at this x value here, there are three corresponding y values. This is not allowed for functions, so the graph in part D here is not a function. So in this video, we've learned about the vertical line test and how to use it to determine whether a graph belongs to a function or not.